now I would like to introduce to you our third speaker, Mariam Chammat. Thank you, Mariam, for being here with us. Mariam Chammat is an executive advisor at the French Behavioral Insights Unit within the Interministerial Directorate for Public Transformation. Her work consists in translating findings and methods from cognitive and behavioral sciences into improvements in public policies and programs. Mariam also works on strengthening evidence-based policy making by developing and piloting projects between policymakers and researchers. Mariam holds a PhD in affective and cognitive neuroscience, where she studied various ways in which emotions can bias perception. She also completed a postdoctoral research here at the Brain and Spine Institute, and her research focused on the neural basis of cognitive dissonance resolution and choice-induced preference change. Passionate about a belief update, in 2015, Mariam co-founded a think tank, CASMA, where she has developed debiasing programs aimed at improving critical thinking skills. CASMA's main aim is to translate findings on cognitive biases into tools that can help improve people's mental habits and their metacognitive skills. Dear Mariam, thank you very much for joining us. The floor is yours.
Perfect. So, being the last thing standing between this fascinating day and your weekend, I'm going to try to make this as interesting and straight to the point as possible. So I've worn my pink elephant jacket, but I'm also going to try to find other ways of nudging your attention. So the last time I stood here was to talk about my postdoctoral work on post-rationalization. And so I'm delighted and thank you for inviting me to share my thoughts and the work that I do on behavioral insights applied to public policy. So what I'm gonna do in the next 20 minutes is first of all tell you more about the work that I do, which is a good integration of everything we saw since this morning. So how do we go from the research on biases, on behavior, and integrate that into public policy to do effective interventions? And then I'm going to talk a bit about what we know on gender equality and rather optimistically what actually does work. So we're leaving with some hope, I hope so. So we started the day talking about stereotypes, and we saw that we are up against something very powerful going on in our brains. And as Tal said earlier, our brain is this incredible statistical machine trying to integrate information from around everything that surrounds us to give us the best guess that it can give us. And this means extracting information very rapidly, and this is something I worked on during my master's and my PhD. So as soon as 100 milliseconds, our brain is already forming, extracting emotion, forming impressions, and it's really hard to combat these first impressions, and they're actually quite useful. The problem is that they're so powerful that sometimes they can make us see things that are very, very differently than they actually are. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with this checkerboard, Edelson's checkerboard, and you probably all know that, whoops, this was a reveal. You probably all know that square A here, which looks darker than square B, for everyone, so if you do see them as exactly the same, let's have a talk at the end. But most of you, I think, see square A as being darker than square B, when in fact these two squares are exactly the same. So if you take this image, and we actually had to print this once for a minister who didn't believe us, and so we had to print it and cut out square A and superpose it on square B to prove that they're actually exactly the same. And so what's really interesting here is that our brain is doing several operations. So first of all, we know usually that in checkerboards, there's an alternation between dark and light squares. And second of all, here we have this shade that's projected over square B, and we usually know that things that are in the shade are usually darker than they appear. So there's these fascinating, extremely quick corrections that our brain is doing, and it's I mean, I can't underline how incredibly amazing it is that our brain is doing us this favor, but the problem is that here we're seeing something very different than it actually is. And so, I mean, I'm going to be cautious in drawing comparisons between cognitive illusions and gender stereotypes because it's not as simple, but the metaphor here is that what are all these things about gender that are preventing us from seeing square B for what it really is, which is this color? So that's a question I'm going to ask about gender, and now I'm going to open a bracket, a parenthesis, to tell you more about the work that I do, and then we're going to go back to gender. So here I just want to tell you a small story of how the field of work that I'm in right now, which is behavioral insights applied to public policy, was born, and it's very related to this idea and the story about biases. So for a very long time, the study of human rationality was actually done by economists, and this idea that humans make choices by weighing costs and benefits, and the idea of the rational choice theory was actually predominant for a long time, until studies, recent studies in cognitive science, psychology, and other fields that study human behavior and human brain started bringing some nuance to this idea that we are extremely rational beings. And with the work of Herbert Simon about bounded rationality, the fact that maybe our rationality is not incredibly unlimited, maybe we have a preference, instability, limited attention, certain constraints that come into play, and even emotions that hinder our decision-making capacity. This opened the way to a lot of research, whether in different fields such as neuroscience, cognitive science, psychology, etc., that started focusing on what are all these things that are preventing us from making the most optimal decisions. And how come sometimes some of our decisions are maybe despite our best interests, sometimes we procrastinate, we don't do sports even though we know it's good, we're not necessarily extremely stable in the things, the choices we make in our preferences. And so in the 1970s, there are two programs, I mean, one of them which was dominant and had very big implications on public policy, which was run by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, which focused on biases and heuristics. And so for 30 years and more, they focused on experiments that put and shed light on the various ways in which our decisions, our perception, our risk-taking behavior or judgments are actually hindered by cognitive biases. And so this, I'm going to caricature it a little bit, but this patchwork of studies that showed that we might have certain things that need a tweak because we're not doing things that are in our best interest, called for interventions, and I'm going to get to that, and open the way of to taking into account psychology in public policies. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of the work of Gerd Gigerenzer, but keep in mind that along this work on biases, there was other work, more in Germany, focused on the idea that maybe these biases are not, in fact, they're not really biases in the sense that they are bad, but more adaptations that are actually useful for us to process the world in a more optimal manner. But let's keep that aside. So the work of Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky was kind of opened the way to the work of Cass Sunstein and Richard Taylor then in the 2000s, and they published a book called Nudge, which became extremely successful and caught the attention of several policymakers around the world. And the idea of nudge, so nudging is just pushing people in the right direction. They give it another definition, which is a bit more broad, and it's to say that it's any aspect of choice architecture that alters people's behavior in a predictable way without forbidding any options or changing their economic incentives. So that's a bit of a jumble word, but just to say that the architecture or the environment in which people make decisions, if we work on that, it might make people's decisions better. So for example, if you're in a cafeteria and we know that when you're coming to the cafeteria, you're hungry, so you really want to take the first thing that you see in front of you. If I put the burgers in front, you're going to take the burgers, but if I change the choice architecture and the way things are presented and I put the salads first, then you might be more inclined to take the salads. So the idea here is that because the biases that we have in different domains are so powerful, and because we cannot rely only on information, we can't educate citizens on every single topic, it's important to change the environment in which we are behaving in a way that removes the burden from the decisions that citizens have to make. So that's how nudging started. That's basically the initial ideas. And by the way, this book was supposed to be called Libertarian Paternalism. So it gives you an idea of the ideology behind it, but the editor said no one would buy your book if it's called that. And the editor was right, because this book then really caught the attention of so many policymakers that right now there are so many units that apply behavioral insights in policies because of this very instrumental work. So let me give you examples of nudges and then show you how we also moved the cursor from nudges to more generally behavioral insights and using research in policy in more recent years. So this is one example of a nudge that I find really interesting because I worked a lot on optical illusions, so I find it nice and people would ask me like, what's applied about cognitive illusions? And so this is very applied. So you have this nice Chicago lake drive where there's a lot of road accidents because people look at the view. And so there are many interventions that were tried there, didn't work, and there were basically the city of Chicago was struggling to find a way to reduce accidents. And so what they did here is they simply drew lines on the floor that you can see on the real road as well, where the lines become closer and closer. And so when you're driving, you're hacking the visual system and the person feels like they're going super fast. And so they automatically slow down because of the line, the illusion that was put there. And so this intervention, which is one example of a nudge, proved to reduce road accidents by 36%. So it's a tweak, basically using illusions to hack our visual system for our own good. To give you other examples so that you can better grasp the idea of nudge, even though I'm giving very simple examples here, but it can take much more complex forms. So these two examples, one of them is basically an intervention done by the Behavioral Insights team, which is a team in the UK that also started in the Prime Minister services there and that does work that is very similar to our team. And one of the members of the BIT, Chloé Chambreau, is here, so if you have questions about those works, you can ask her. And so the intervention here was basically adding a sentence which nudges people to to pay their taxes on time by reminding them of the norm. So 9 people out of 10 pay their taxes on time. This shows you that your behavior is probably a minority behavior if you are late, and so this increased the number of payments and allowed the tax authorities to collect more than £230 million a year. So the interventions have good cost benefit in the sense that it's a small change, but it has very big impact. Another company in the United States, O-Power, changed the way they present your energy bill, showing you your energy consumption compared to efficient neighbors and compared to all neighbors. And so this gives you a very quick indication of how much you're over-consuming. It's just a visual tweak and basically can have an impact on energy reduction. Bearing in mind that when people were below, they started using more electricity, so O-Power had to change the positive feedback for those categories. Which means that it's not as simple and you just need to monitor the long-term effects as well. Another intervention was also sending, so basically things like when you have doctors over-prescribing antibiotics, you can't use regulation, you can't give them fines, you can't use laws, so you need to find a way to give them feedback on their over-prescription, which cause antibiotic resistance, and it's one of the biggest health issues right now in the world. And so basically sending them letters and feedback showing them where they are in terms of prescription compared to the general population of doctors can give them a good feedback and indication and seems to have worked to reduce massively the antibiotic prescription in the UK. This didn't work exactly the same in France, but we'll come back to that later. So other things are like for projects that are right now underway in certain countries, for example, changing the beginning of the time of school for adolescents, because we know that there's changes in their sleep cycles, etc. This is to counter dropouts from schools, and for example, simply changing the way people by default save for their retirement. And this is actually Save More Tomorrow is a program for which Richard Taylor, one of the authors of Nudge, got the Nobel Prize because a very simple change in the architecture of the way people save led to massive savings. Okay, so first of all, these were examples of simple, I would say, nudges, and they're examples that were used in the very early days. I would say early 2010s. And right now, things have changed a little bit, and the interventions aren't as simple. Interventions are quite complex, and they're experimental research that take around, I don't know, 1 year, and the interventions became kind of more sophisticated. And so another aspect of what I do, which has developed very much in the recent years, is the idea of doing randomized controlled trials on very big scales to test what works. And the reason for that is that, first of all, research on human behavior usually is very rarely accounted for in public policies. And many things are put into place without being tested. So for example, imagine you're a policymaker and you want to solve the issue of parents coming late to bring their kids from school or from the nursery. And you can imagine that as a policymaker, the most intuitive solution to this problem is putting a fine. You just fine the parents, they come on time, magic. Except when this was tested, not only did it not work, so parents not only didn't come on time, but they started coming later than initially with the fine. First of all, because the guilt of coming late disappeared with the fine. So you come late, you're like, okay, I pay for it. And second of all, the amount was not that big, so they would integrate it as a service. So if I come half an hour late, I pay this much. An hour late, I pay that much. And so it was perceived as a service rather as something that deters the behavior. And so one thing is that human behavior can be counterintuitive. A lot of things that policymakers might think be intrinsic motivation are not actually exactly like that. So for example, in Sweden, when they changed the blood donation system in a way that people, instead of being altruistically giving their blood, were now paid to give their blood, much less people started giving their blood because the motivation was now extrinsic and not intrinsic anymore. And so there are a lot of things that are important to take into account from human psychology to make policies better. And second of all, not only should we take into account behavior, but we should also be able to test on a small scale to see whether there are backfire effects before scaling on the whole country. So basically, if I had to summarize what I do, the idea is that if you look at the classical tools, the traditional tools that are used to do policy making, it's often regulation, taxation, information, except that policies usually are targeting behavior. So for a policy to work, whether it's a policy on recycling, on road safety, on retirement, any policy that you take, for it to work, it targets human behavior. So my work consists in integrating behavioral insights and research to make these policy tools better, but also to run experiments and test what works by taking into account behavior before being scaled. I'm close to closing the bracket on what I do to go back to gender, but just to tell you that this idea of using behavioral insights to inform policy has become really popular. And the OECD right now has, I think the last numbers were something like more than 300 units around the world. And in France, we have a central model where we have a small unit that is operating with different ministries, but in other countries, each ministry could have their own unit in some cases. So our team is a very small one. We work in the Ministry of Transformation and Public Services, and we also partner with the Behavioral Insights team that I mentioned earlier. That is a much bigger team, and French researchers that are in Agence d'Innovation Comportementale, and we have certain partnerships and exchange programs with ENS. And we can come back to this later. The majority of our projects are not necessarily on gender, but I'm going to talk about gender nevertheless, don't worry. But so we work a lot on things like consumer protection, we work on getting young people to join the workforce in better conditions. We've worked on things like stereotypes against disabilities with Pôle emploi, which is a public employment service. We also work on topics about environment. So, for example, labels to get people to repair their electronics, or, for example, the exposure of children to screens. And I'm not going to go into all of them, but we can go back to the slide if you have any specific questions about our policy areas. So, in concluding, and in the next 5 to 10 minutes, just to tell you certain things about gender. So we haven't run a project specifically on this topic, but when I first joined the team, my structure in 2016, and in the early days, 2016, 2017, I participated more as an observer to a project of evaluation of actions that were done in France in favor of diversity in the workplace. And what was extremely striking in this report and in following the action of those evaluators was the amount of details on which you need to work to counter gender bias. And so I don't know if you want to read this report, it's quite long, but it's fascinating to see the amount of threads. So if you imagine it to be like a huge tissue, each thread is biased, and you need to disentangle each of it. So, for example, you need to work on representation of women of science in scientific manuals. You need to work on biases in algorithms in phones. Yesterday, I was having lunch with one of my colleagues who was saying it's crazy that in Carte Vitale, women are number 2 instead of number 1. So it's like, it's so intricate, and it's in so many details that you don't even know where to start if you want to counter gender bias. And it's a really long-term work. Another thing that was striking in this report was that initially, when I started talking to the evaluators who were working on this topic, I had the strong intuition that diversity programs would be very effective, and that it would be, what could go wrong in getting people to learn more information about gender biases? What could go wrong if you take Pôle emploi agents, so the public employment service agents, and you just give them a workshop on gender stereotypes? And so it's interesting to see from what was presented right now and from all the data in the recent years that it actually can be counterproductive, and that maybe someone who goes to a diversity training might feel immune to biases, and it's actually not a good thing to do. So it's, the fact that some things might intuitively seem to work is basically the essence of what I do. And so trying to counter these intuitions and say, okay, we're going to go and see what can we test, what actually does work, and what is counterintuitive, is something that has been done a lot in the recent years, which wasn't the case as soon as 2017. So it's also very encouraging to see all the things that have advanced in such a little time. So I'm going to show you 2 quick experiments, which are not done by our team, but rather than from the Behavioral Insights team, which has a program actually on gender and behavioral insights called the GABI program. And it also draws on work that was done by Iris Bonnet, which I'm sure some of you know, who is a reference in behaviorally informed policymaking. So the reason I chose these 2 examples is not because they are the most important or the most massive, but it's to show you that, first of all, we need to work on every single detail, and small details matter, and we also need to take into account in which context things work and in which context they might not work. So one of them is this idea of changing the way a CV is presented, to help support people back into work. So the idea here is an experiment that was done by the Behavioral Insights team. Chloe can maybe answer some of the questions you might have on it, but so the fact that recruiters spend very little time reading a CV gets us to this idea that maybe the way information is presented in a CV is quite important. And so we know that 91% of career break returners are women because they have children or they stop to care for others. And so here what was tested was a randomized control trial where 9,000 CVs were sent to real job vacancies, and a comparison was done between 4 different ways of presenting the CV. So either CVs that have gaps, but the gap is unexplained, or no gap, or a gap that is explained, so written on the CV childcare, or no dates. And instead of putting dates, for example, 2013 to 2016, I did this, this part was presented in terms of experience. So I have 3 years of experience doing this, etc., etc. And so when this randomized control trial was tested, the results show that if you present your previous roles in terms of number of years of experience rather than dates, then it can increase positive callbacks by around 15%, which is quite striking for something that is such a small intervention and such a small change in the way information is presented. And so the reason I chose this example is to show you how much the devil is really in the details. Another thing is that we know since the 1970s, so since blind auditions in orchestras that showed that when you have blind auditions, you have much more women who are taken in the symphonic orchestras, this idea of anonymizing CVs became popular. And a question was, maybe we should remove gender information, or even information about your ethnicity or your name, etc. in CVs. And so we might think also intuitively that since it worked for orchestras, it might work. I mean, there's no reason why if you remove gender from a CV, it won't work. And the data actually shows that, yes, it does have a lot of benefits. So first of all, it prevents discrimination in the initial stages of screening. Also, it can boost job rates just by because you can then have much more minority candidates, and it signals your interest as a company and your commitment to focus on skills rather than on gender. So these are good things. But when it has been tested in several different contexts, it shows that it reduces discrimination only when discrimination is high. So when there's no discrimination, when discrimination is low, the effect isn't as strong. Also, another thing, and this was discussed earlier, it might remove bias at this stage, but then once the person is hired, discrimination will be postponed later on to the hiring process. Another thing is that it can be very disadvantageous if the identity is unknown, because recruiters can then have less ways of correcting information that they see on a CV. So, for example, if they don't know the disadvantaged family background of someone, or they don't know like the person has a specific migration status, then they can't explain for things like average education outcomes or labor market inexperience or weak language skills, because they don't have this information to correct for. So this was actually something that was shown in a very large randomized control trial done in Pôle emploi by JPAL, which is a very skilled and important evaluation lab. And so the message that I wanted to convey with this specific slide is that, yes, certain things can work, but it's really hard to say, yeah, it definitely works in all contexts. So sometimes each context has specificities, and you should take those into account. And so our work is a bit difficult in the sense that even when we run experiments and we show that something works, we can't say it definitely will work all the time in all contexts. So every time we need to retest. And just to finish on this slide, some certain places have even started dropping CVs, so working more on like skill-based assessment. And given that recruiters spend so little time on CVs anyway, maybe we just don't need them. So to end this day, and I hope you're still hanging in there for the roundtable, just to tell you that the report that I showed earlier from the Behavioral Insights team has this very nice table that summarizes actions that are effective, in the sense that they have been, sorry, this might not be very clear, I realize, but you can read the report to see which actions have been tested, replicated, and proven to be quite effective. actions that are promising because they work in certain contexts but need to be a bit, you need to pay attention to the context, and actions such as, for example, the diversity trainings, which work but in very specific contexts and that might actually have strong backfire effects, so for which you might want to take extra attention. I won't go into each of them for the sake of time, but they're very nicely summarized, and what's interesting is that in this report you can find for each of these actions all the studies that have been done that show the robustness of the findings. To conclude, I'm going to borrow Iris Bonnet's optimistic way of seeing things. So I think it also summarizes the day, I guess, nicely. The idea here is that to improve gender equality, we need to debias systems rather than people, much more focus on structure and systems, and we need to base it on rigorous evidence of what works. And building on what works, behavioral designs can create fair organizations, and even though they might not solve all problems, and it's going to take time for us to solve everything, at least they can move the needle a bit and extremely fast. And so with this, hopefully, message of hope, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me and for the great day and the extremely valuable information that I think we all learned. So thank you for your attention.